Were you the one who led me here? You must have been waiting all this time. Waiting 2,000 years, just for somebody.
After over a decade, Attack on Titan has ended. But even after watching Eren's defeat and the end of the Titans, we're still left with one question that the story doesn't answer for us. What did it all mean? That is not an easy question to answer, and to do so we need to take a step back and analyze the stories of Eren, Armin, and Mikasa. But most importantly, we need to uncover the truth behind Attack on Titan's most confusing character, Ymir Fritz. Despite not speaking a single word throughout the story, it's hard to overstate Ymir's significance. Nearly every event in the story can be linked back to her, whether directly or indirectly. But Ymir is a very strange character. Despite how important she is, we know next to nothing about her motives, leaving us to piece them together through wordless hints and context clues. In order to understand the meaning of Attack on Titan and the role each main character played in the ending, we also have to answer the difficult question of what Ymir's purpose was. What did Isayama want to say when he wrote her into the story? When myself and my friend Luciano set out to analyze Ymir, we knew that it wouldn't be easy. We knew that in order to understand a character with no dialogue, and to grasp the meaning behind her actions, it would take analyzing her every appearance with excruciating detail. So that's exactly what we did. We deliberated for hours on end, dissecting every panel Ymir appears in. We created endless hypotheses for her every thought at every moment in the story. And finally, we arrived at our answers. Over the course of this video, it should become clear just how interconnected Ymir is with each of the main characters, and how central her arc is to the conclusion of the story. As you watch the video, it's important to remember that we're talking about a character without any dialogue. Both Ymir's characterization and the ending of the story are very much open to interpretation. Whether you agree with our findings or not, I hope that you enjoy the video regardless. Like always, I'll be showing evidence that I believe supports our conclusions on screen whenever possible. With all of that out of the way, we can begin. Understanding the ending of Attack on Titan starts at the beginning of what we know about Ymir. And while not all of this may be new to you, I would encourage you not to skip ahead in the video. It's important to start with the basics to make sure everyone is on the same page. When the Eldian tribe attacked her village, Ymir watched helplessly as everyone she knew was ruthlessly slaughtered. The survivors, herself included, were maimed and subjugated into servitude. Ymir found herself truly alone in the world, and in her pain and isolation, Ymir sought both the connection with others and the freedom that had been taken from her. It was because of that she soon took notice of the village's pigs. Their freedom had been taken away, and now they were held captive against their will. She had realized that the pigs' situation wasn't unlike her own, and so she had come to sympathize with them. It was for that reason that Ymir decided to open their pen, giving them the freedom that she could only dream of. And as a result of her actions, she was granted a twisted version of her own freedom by Fritz, the leader of the tribe. But this freedom was nothing like what Ymir had dreamt of. Instead, it was a punishment, a death sentence at the hands of those who had taken everything from her. Moments before dying, however, a mere coincidence would save her life. Ymir happened to make contact with the source of all living matter, the hallucigenia under the tree, and as it fused to her spine, the first Titan was born. Ymir had escaped death, and she now held the power to destroy those who had wronged her. With the power of the Titans, Ymir could now go anywhere and do anything. She should have been free. And yet, despite her newfound abilities, Ymir returned to Fritz. But why? From the moment she was subjugated, Ymir had wished for freedom. Her choice to free the pigs had been an expression of that unconscious desire. Despite her oppressive circumstances, she had made a decision and acted on her own free will. But Ymir was still a child, with a child's rationality and thoughts. And when she was punished for acting on her free will, it must have affected her on a psychological level. She learned that acting on her free will had been a mistake, and that having agency only meant pain. None of this would have ever happened, Ymir must have reasoned, if only she hadn't made that choice. And because she had mistakenly reached that conclusion, Ymir did not rebel, even though she had the power to do so. She simply accepted the status quo of her life as it was, returning to Fritz as his slave. But her life would change upon her return. Ymir now had power, and Fritz would exploit it. With the founding Titan, Eldia began to grow into a nation, with Fritz as its first king. And yet Fritz was not satisfied. He would soon look again towards conquest. To that end, Ymir became a weapon of war, unquestioningly bringing death to the king's enemies. And amidst that bloodshed, she was forced to bear Fritz 3 children. In every aspect of her life, Ymir's freedom had been stolen by King Fritz's abuse. 13 years later, the now massive Eldian Empire had come to dominate the continent with little opposition. On this day, however, things would finally change. Without warning, a spear flew from within the army's ranks. It was an assassination attempt on the king. His death would have set Ymir free of his control, yet it was she who threw her own body in front of the spear. Having saved the king's life by intercepting the fatal blow aimed at him, Ymir collapsed in a pool of her own blood. Fritz knew that her powers would keep her from dying, but as he ordered Ymir to rise and work, she didn't listen. Instead, she died on the spot. And yet, even despite her seemingly contradictory death, she had not been set free. Awakening in a black void, Ymir found herself in the wasteland that would one day come to be known as the Paths. It was a world free from the passage of time, where Ymir could carry out the king's orders for eternity. As years turned to decades and decades turned to centuries, the founder Ymir became ancient history. To Eldia, she'd become a god. To Marley, she'd become a demon. But all of them alike, including Ymir herself, had long forgotten the humanity of the person suffering at the center of it all. However, even as she toiled away for millennia, unquestioningly obeying the words of the king's descendants, the long-dormant wish for freedom that Ymir had once held would remain buried within the depths of her heart. How would Ymir's lost desire for freedom be rekindled? How would she regain the free will that had been stolen from her, and how would she be freed from the hell that she remained trapped within? To answer each one of these questions requires understanding each of our main characters, their ideologies, and the different ways that they affected Ymir. And by piecing all of this together, we can also begin to piece together the meaning of the ending as a whole. The first step in doing so is to examine Eren's role in Ymir's arc. Nearly 2,000 years after her death, Eren's own pursuit of freedom had led him to her. He had reached the world of paths where Ymir resided, and he was the first person outside of the royal bloodline to ever do so. It was this nearly impossible meeting that would finally shake Ymir's stagnant existence and set her on the path towards freedom. Eren would first try to command Ymir, but she would ignore him as she recognized Zeke's authority instead of his own. She was still carrying out her orders to obey the royal family from so long ago, and so she would follow Zeke without question. Eren soon tore free of the chains placed on him and gave chase in a desperate attempt to stop her. In the moment he would reach her, her memories began to flood into him. He would learn of Ymir's unending suffering and of her eternal servitude. For 2,000 years, she had toiled away on Fritz's orders, alone, without even the freedom to question her own circumstances. Each king that followed had perpetuated her abuse by commanding her again and again to do their bidding. Each of them had disregarded her humanity, treating her as a tool just as King Fritz once had. Eren had now seen the extent of Ymir's abuse. What had been done to her was the greatest crime imaginable. Her freedom and her free will itself had been stolen from her, and having finally learned of that injustice, Eren understood what he had to do.
You're no slave. You're no god. You're just a person. You don't need to serve anyone. You can be the one to choose.
For the first time in her life, Ymir was offered a choice. She could support Eren or continue to carry out the king's orders just as she had been. But, Eren told her, no matter what she decided to do, it would be her own choice, her own act of free will, not as a slave or a god, but as a human being. With his words, she had finally been acknowledged as a person. You can choose. Those were the words that Ymir had waited 2,000 years to hear. Until now, the concept of making a choice of her own free will, or even acknowledging her own pain, must have been unthinkable. She had obeyed her orders mechanically and without question, because that was her role as both Ymir the slave and Ymir the god. But, Eren told her, the role she had been forced into didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was human, and that her suffering had been ignored by everyone. That acknowledgement was what Ymir had desperately needed to hear. Eren's recognition of her humanity was enough to cut through 2,000 years of her own self-deception. Yes, Ymir finally admitted to herself, she had experienced a lifetime of suffering. She wasn't a slave, nor was she a god. She was just an ordinary girl. Her facade as both a mindless tool and as an emotionless god would fall apart then and there. She would grieve for the pain she had endured in her first act of self-expression in thousands of years. Her next steps, whether or not she continued to follow the king's orders, would be a choice of her own free will, and her choice as an autonomous human being would be to support the one who had treated her as one. Ymir would share her power with Eren, granting him access to the Founding Titan's abilities, and allowing him to control the paths just as she had done for so long. What Eren did with those powers didn't matter to her. All it did was that it was her choice to support him. It was an expression of the free will that had been returned to her. And by Eren's will alone, the rumbling would begin. But even though Ymir's free will had been returned to her, she had not been freed. She still remained trapped within the purgatorial world of the paths, unable to leave everything behind. And it was from there that Ymir would watch as Eren began to flatten the world. As she watched the destruction unfold, Ymir must have felt nothing. She seemingly felt no contempt for humans, nor did she share in Eren's vision of an empty world. Ymir felt nothing at all, not even as she watched the innocent brothers get crushed before her eyes. Death, which was all too familiar to her, had likely long since lost all meaning. She had witnessed the massacre of her village and her family. She had been commanded to slaughter countless people on the king's orders, and for the 2 millennia after her death, the titans that she molded from sand had been used as cannibalistic weapons of war. She had become desensitized to the death that was present in every part of her life. That those lives could hold value must have never even occurred to her, and because death was meaningless to her, she would allow the rumbling to continue without intervening. Yet, even with her inability to empathize with the perpetrator nor victims of the massacre in front of her, Ymir observed it all. Her newfound free will had led her to begin searching for her own understanding of the world. For the first time since she was a young child, she began to question what she saw. What was the meaning of the violence she was witnessing? What was the meaning of the humanity that had been restored to her? And for what must have been the first time, Ymir looked inwards for an understanding of herself and the meaning behind her own suffering. Above all, the most pressing question remained. Why was she still trapped, suffering in the world that had long ago left her behind? Why was she still not free? Having simultaneously regained all of her senses that had been sealed away for so long, Ymir sought these answers amidst the end of the world. So, while Eren commanded the Titans to flatten the earth, Ymir observed. There was one thing that caught Ymir's attention amidst the chaos: Eren's friends who had come to stop him. Ymir must have wondered, why did they oppose him? Why were they trying to stop the rumbling? Their actions and their resolve must have intrigued her. Ymir continued supporting Eren with an army of resurrected Titans, even as the Alliance landed on his back and attempted to take his life. But most importantly for Ymir, their battle now gave her the chance to observe their actions even closer, especially the actions of Armin. Like Eren, Armin would play a role in Ymir's arc. While that role often goes overlooked, its importance really can't be overstated. It would ultimately be what put a stop to the rumbling altogether. Ymir would trap Armin in the world of paths for the purpose of observing him even closer. It was there that Armin would encounter Zeke, who would also become a prisoner. Zeke had fallen into despair. His life's work had collapsed before his eyes. In its place, Eren had begun to destroy everything. As Zeke watched on in helpless resignation as his own blood was used to fuel that destruction, he too, like Ymir, had contemplated on what the meaning of everything was. Billions of years ago, when life had first appeared on the planet, it had one function above all: to multiply. It had been programmed with the inherent desire to survive so that it could increase its numbers before dying. Even as life diversified and became more complex, this simple function would remain. Humanity followed that function as well. The desire of humanity to survive at all costs, and the fear that humans felt when facing death, were nothing more than programmed biological functions. Their purpose was to ensure the survival of the species. But that survival came at a cost. The individuals brought into existence, such as Zeke himself, would lead lives full of suffering. And no matter how much suffering was inflicted, or whether its own continuation was actually a good thing, life's desperate search for multiplication would not stop. The only way to escape this meaningless cycle of madness, Zeke decided, was to forcibly put an end to it. And so, after becoming a warrior, he had euthanized countless innocent people without remorse. By doing so, he believed that he was freeing them and their would-be descendants from the cycle of multiplication that they were unknowingly trapped within. But now, having had his plans ruined and forced to watch the destruction unfold, he questioned, was this really so different from the euthanasia plan that he himself had wanted? In this world where life was suffering and death was a mercy, was there any meaning in stopping Eren's slaughter? Zeke was not alone in how he felt. Unknowingly, his words had given a voice to Ymir's own unspoken thoughts. Though their reasoning may have greatly differed, they had seemingly both reached the same conclusion over the course of their blood-stained lives. Human life had no value. The lives being extinguished by Eren were no different. Stopping the rumbling was pointless. So, Ymir and Zeke both wondered, what was it that drove Armin to try to stop it? Armin could not refute all of what Zeke said, because in a way, Zeke wasn't wrong. Armin had seen the reality of the world in all of its cruelty again and again. Life was full of suffering, and there wasn't some grand purpose driving their continued existence through that suffering. However, Armin countered, Zeke was wrong that no meaning could be found within the endless multiplication that had led them to this point. Just by living their lives, humans were capable of finding meaning in an existence that had no purpose. The trivial, almost forgettable moments amid the suffering gave Armin's life meaning, and gave him the courage to stand against the cruelty he had faced over and over. A race to a tree, feeding an animal, or a book on a rainy day. These memories of joy were enough to give meaning to the existence known as life, despite them not factoring into its continuation. Humanity, with its ability to experience the world, had itself become an argument for life's value. Zeke, too, had experienced what Armin described. In his own suffering, he had found his joy in the act of playing catch with his foster father. It felt like a trivial memory, and yet he did treasure it. Why did such a pointless act, irrelevant to life's continuation, make him feel this way? That contradiction was evidence in itself that there was more to life than multiplication. From Zeke's point of view, life was an endless cycle of suffering. Wanting to end that cycle was not wrong, nor was his euthanasia plan. That much Zeke knew to be true, and nothing could change his mind. But, Zeke realized, what Armin had said also held true. If it meant being able to play catch again, he really wouldn't have minded living another day. Though he still would have chosen to have never been born, the life he had lived had not been valueless. Ymir, on the other hand, hadn't been able to experience any of the things that Armin described. Her life, and the happy memories she should have had been stolen from her. Until her free will had been restored by Eren, Ymir had only done what she was told. But as she witnessed the debate between Armin and Zeke, she was given two opposing sides of an argument of which she could weigh and choose between. Ymir had sided with Eren because of the fact that he had offered her a choice. She felt nothing for the millions of deaths happening around her. In that way, Zeke's apathy towards life and death echoed her own feelings. But as the conversation progressed, she witnessed Armin expose the contradiction in Zeke's argument. Zeke was forced to acknowledge that even if it was minuscule, there was meaning in stopping Eren's massacre. His memories, which he had perceived as meaningless, were proof of that. Armin had refuted Zeke's apathy, and by extension, he had refuted Ymir's as well. Caring for human life was a foreign concept to her. It likely always had been. But how could she sit back and do nothing after she had come to understand what moved people to continue living? Armin's words had reached her, and Ymir had come to empathize with the Alliance's cause. No matter how small, there was value in life, and therefore value in stopping the rumbling. Ymir had formulated an opinion, and a desire of her own. She now wanted to stop it. And in her second choice as an individual, she would choose to grant Armin and Zeke the power to stop it. Just like Eren had been given control over paths, they would be given that same power. This would allow them to escape and to summon Titans to their own cause. And having acknowledged the value of preserving life, Zeke would sacrifice what little was left of his own to do so. The death toll had been incalculable, but it would end there. The rumbling had finally been stopped. And yet, after everything, and despite her free will having been restored, Ymir still remained trapped in the world of paths. And to understand why Ymir still wasn't free, we have to revisit the contradictory moment of her death. 2,000 years earlier, Ymir had died shielding King Fritz from the spear that should have killed him, but her death itself raises a number of questions. Having had her free will stolen, Ymir simply didn't possess the agency needed to defy the king's orders by deliberately ending her own life. And because of that, we can confidently assume that Ymir had only thrown herself into the spear to protect the king. But despite the fact that she had not intended to die, her injury, which should have been inconsequential, ended her life. And that contradiction reveals something else. In the few short moments between when she had saved King Fritz and her death, Ymir had somehow lost the will to live. But what could have caused that to happen? Uncovering the answer to that question is one of the most difficult yet important topics in all of Attack on Titan. To help answer it, I'm going to bring in Luciano to speak directly.
The jump to protect King Fritz is arguably the most pivotal moment in Ymir's arc. Not only does it connect to a lot of the elements that come before and after, it also sends her further down the path of agonizing loneliness. What is she thinking and feeling when she jumps? Why did she jump at all? Why does she die despite her powers? I think we're meant to ask these questions because trying to answer them paints a picture about Ymir and her actions. What happens after Ymir jumps is the really interesting and telling part of this sequence of events. Fritz points out she couldn't possibly die from a spear, which is referring to the Titan Shifter's regenerative abilities being tied to their will to live. This means that something about what King Fritz said in relation to her actions made Ymir lose the will to live and bleed out as a result. What was it about this moment that made Ymir feel so tired and done, in contrast to her years on end of serving the king without question? What was it about this moment that made Ymir break? I think what is very telling is the flower we are shown during the moments she closes her eyes just before dying. This is the same flower, and the exact same shot for that matter, that we were shown when she was pursued after freeing the pigs. This blood-stained flower is meant to connect the emotion she is feeling in both moments, as well as the nature of the inner conflict she is facing.
When she jumped in front of the spear, Ymir had disregarded what she had learned after freeing the pigs. It had been a split-second decision, but Ymir had chosen to trust her own judgment and save the king without being ordered to do so. For the first time in 13 years, Ymir had acted on her own free will. And how did the king respond to her actions? He did nothing but give more commands. He showed Ymir no gratitude for having saved his life, nor did he express any concern for her injuries. Despite the fact that she had chosen to save him, the king remained just as cruel as he had always been. But why would a continuation of the king's callous attitude, after so many years of it, suddenly affect Ymir enough to cause her to give in to despair? The answer to that question lies in understanding Ymir's desire for connection. From the moment she had been subjugated, Ymir had been alone, and she desperately wanted to escape that isolation in any way that she could. Her desire was so strong, in fact, that it manifested even after her death, leading to the creation of the paths that connected all of her descendants. And that's why, when King Fritz feigned his approval of her, Ymir would mistakenly come to interpret that approval as the type of human connection that she had sought. Of course, King Fritz was pure evil. He never cared about Ymir, taking advantage of her to increase his own power and to expand his domain. But in her mind, Fritz had given her the human connection that she thought she wanted so badly. He had praised her, proclaimed her his wife, and given her his children. She was only a child, and she had no way of knowing how terrible what Fritz had done really was, nor that she was a victim of his abuse. And because she thought that he had given her the human connection that she had always wanted, Ymir would come to care for him.
That is the reason why she jumped to protect the king. She had developed a certain affection for him, born out of innocence, abuse, loneliness, and a warped sense of selflessness. This was not love, as Eren would describe it, but instead a twisted form of affection that resulted from Ymir's desire to be close to someone, a nightmare as Mikasa would interpret it. And as a result, Ymir did long for attention from the king. In this panel we can see her looking at a happy king surrounded by other women, and Ymir's expression is one of dissatisfaction or jealousy. When she saved the king's life and again trusted her instincts, she must have expected a similar reaction from him. But when she was met with animosity instead, it felt like punishment. She was punished again for wanting, for having agency, and for believing, just like when she freed those pigs. And on top of that, the fact that she had now repeated that same perceived mistake may have added to her feelings of self-hatred. Despite everything, she still hadn't learned that she mustn't have agency and that she mustn't want. That must be how Ymir felt, and I think that is why she gives up.
Ymir watched the person she had grown to care for treat her with the disdain of a slave who refused to work. And as Luciano said, that realization, following her own actions, is why Ymir lost the will to live. By saving him, she had once again expressed her own will, and she had once again been punished for doing so. Unable to heal her wounds, Ymir would die that day. She would stay in the paths, never again acting of her own volition, until centuries later when Eren would offer her a choice. But even now, after having had her free will restored, Ymir still couldn't discard her bond with Fritz. Her desire to be connected continued to haunt her, rendering her unable to let go of the final connection that continued to bind her to the world, no matter how terrible in nature it was. That brings us to Mikasa, and the conclusion of the story. While Eren and Armin had both imparted important lessons on Ymir, it would be Mikasa whose actions would finally give Ymir freedom and allow her to pass on. Before we can understand why that is, we also have to understand Mikasa herself. When she was 9 years old, Mikasa witnessed the murder of both of her parents. Left alone and traumatized, she resigned to her fate. But in her lowest moment, Eren would appear and offer her a choice. She could fight and live on, or she could die then and there. At that moment, she had a realization. The world was a cruel place full of meaningless violence, and the only way to survive in it was to fight. However, there was beauty to be found amidst that cruelty. To Mikasa, the kindness that Eren offered her was just that. From that moment on, it would become her meaning for living. Eren was kind, and his kindness had saved her. He had become her home, and as long as she had him, she could face the cruelty of the world. But the life Mikasa had come to dream of with Eren was impossible. As the years passed and they experienced countless hardships, it seemed that Eren's path was destined to diverge from her own. And when Eren began taking actions that went against what she knew was right, their relationship began to fracture. 10 years earlier, Eren's kindness had saved her and given meaning to her life. What he had done was undoubtedly a good thing, but there was another side to his actions on that day. From the start, his kindness had been predicated on an act of extreme violence. Eren had brutally murdered those who stood in his way, and his capacity for such violence, even as a child, was something Mikasa had tried to avoid thinking about. But now she was forced to acknowledge it when Eren unleashed that violence beyond the walls. Mikasa had pledged her life as a soldier of humanity, one who defended innocence. But now, Eren was the one propagating the very cruelty that she had fought so hard against. When she lost Eren, Mikasa had also lost her home, and because of that, she had to look inwards and examine her own feelings for the first time. If Eren was capable of such violence, she wondered, what was the beauty she had seen in him? Was the love she had come to feel for him real, or was it a response to the trauma she'd been subjected to a decade ago? Had it all been meaningless? As Mikasa struggled to answer those questions, she would also have to make a choice, whether to stand by Eren even though she knew it was wrong, or to oppose him, an act that would mean permanently casting aside her home and abandoning her fundamental understanding of the world. Thinking back, Mikasa knew that there was some truth to what Eren had once told her. Her reliance on him as her home had been brought about as a result of her traumatic experiences. But through her own will, she had come to realize another truth. Through everything they'd been through, her love for Eren was pure. It hadn't been the result of something else. It was fully her own. She cared for Eren, but he had done terrible, unforgivable things. And now, Mikasa knew that she had to be the one to stop him. It was only through the painful choice to say goodbye, Mikasa had come to understand, that she could truly honor what she shared with Eren. With that newfound resolve, she would take Eren's life, severing their connection. It was watching that decision that caused Ymir to take an interest in Mikasa. From the world of paths where time had no meaning, Ymir observed her choice and everything that had led to it. And as Ymir retroactively witnessed her past, she would learn of Mikasa's hardships and the countless struggles she had faced. She would also learn of her ideals, her hopes, and her bonds. But most importantly, Ymir would learn of her connection with Eren and of the gravity behind her decision to stop him. Ymir realized that, for the first time, Mikasa had acknowledged her true feelings for Eren, not as her home, but as a person. Her decision to oppose him had been the hardest decision of her life, but in doing so, Mikasa had reached the answer she sought. Mikasa's bold choice had managed to reach Ymir, and what she witnessed had pushed her to, once again, look inwards. A new possibility had opened up for Ymir, and it was one she hadn't had the means to consider on her own, that she had the power to free herself from even the most painful and complex of connections. Looking back on her own life, Ymir could now understand that her desire to be connected to someone had been exploited by the king. The attachment that she had been haunted by for 2,000 years had been the result. All along, the king had been in the wrong, and she had been a victim of his abuse. But her life hadn't been devoid of the genuine connections that she sought. She had realized it too late, but she had experienced true love and a bond with her 3 children. If she could do everything over again, Ymir thought, she would not have jumped in front of that spear to save the king. She would leave him to die, instead choosing the life with their children that she had lost. And by acknowledging that, Ymir had severed her connection with King Fritz, breaking free of his influence. She was, at last, truly free. Through the lessons that had been imparted on her, Ymir's autonomy, her humanity, and her freedom had been restored. At peace with herself, Ymir would smile for the very first time. Finally ready to move on from the world, she would fade away, the power of the Titans vanishing alongside her. Given how we've just gone over an overwhelming amount of information, and because of the complexity of the themes we're discussing, I wanted to take a quick aside to be very direct about the meaning of what we just talked about. An important part of the ending is the narrative parallel between Ymir and Mikasa. Like we talked about, Ymir learns an important lesson about human connection from Mikasa, and that's what allows her to finally move on. However, it's important to understand that this is the only parallel Isayama intended. Ymir and Mikasa share nothing else in common. Their lives, their hardships, and even the nature of their relationships directly contrast one another. The sole aspect that Ymir and Mikasa share is that they both have a relationship that they had to reevaluate. Because of their single parallel, it's tempting to also want to look for parallels in the nature of their bonds with Eren and King Fritz. However, Isayama certainly did not intend for those comparisons to be drawn. Eren and King Fritz are entirely different types of characters without anything in common. In fact, Eren is an antithesis to King Fritz, restoring Ymir's free will that Fritz had once stolen from her. Because King Fritz and Eren are different, the way that Ymir and Mikasa each reevaluate their connection is also different. Mikasa learns that she can let go of Eren while still caring about him, and without forgetting the kindness he showed her. What Ymir learns, however, is very different. Ymir learns that she can let go of the king, and that everything he had done was wrong. If you only take one thing from this video, let it be this. By the end of the story, Ymir comes to regret saving King Fritz, and wishes that she had instead let him die. There's no character in the story more blatantly, undeniably evil than King Fritz. There's no room to defend him nor his actions, and Isayama is very direct about the fact that his relationship with Ymir was wrong. With that clarification out of the way, we can discuss the conclusion of the story. "2,000 years ago, the power of the Titans was brought into the world through a chance encounter between Ymir and the Hallucigenia. But while their meeting may have been a coincidence, the Titans that were created as a result were not. When Ymir fell under the tree, she was on the brink of death. Traumatized and bleeding out, she had one single desire left: to survive. When the Hallucigenia attached itself to her spinal cord, it fulfilled that single desire in the only way that it knew how. Ymir was granted a colossal, undying form, immune to the weapons that had caused her so much pain. With it, she would never be threatened by humans again, and she could easily crush those who had harmed her. But of course, she didn't do that. Throughout her life and even after her death, the Titans, tools that had been created for her own survival, would be exploited by the very man whose cruelty had led to their inception. Just as the Titans had been born from Ymir's pain, they would vanish alongside it. With Ymir's freedom, the power of the Titans would disappear from the world as if it had never existed to begin with. However, despite everything seemingly having ended, that was not the end of the story. Far into the future, long after Shiganshina had been reduced to rubble, history would begin to repeat itself. As the once urban cityscape was overtaken by vegetation, the tree sitting atop the remains of the founding Titan would grow until it towered above the forest that surrounded it. It would continue to grow until it came to resemble the tree that Ymir had fled into thousands of years earlier. Against all odds, the Hallucigenia had survived, and when another child begins approaching that tree at the very end of the story, it starts to seem like the Titans are about to be reborn, and that everything our characters fought for will be made meaningless. But that won't happen. We can say without a doubt that this boy will not bring the Titans back into the world. When the Hallucigenia made contact with Ymir, it had given physical form to her desire to survive. The immense power she was granted had simply been the result. Had it stopped there, the horrors of the Titans may have never been born to begin with. But Ymir had lived a life of unbelievable tragedy, and when she came into contact with the Hallucigenia, it had also given form to her sorrow, her pain, and her fear. It had taken in all of her thoughts and feelings, and the result had been the creation of immortal, cannibalistic monsters. Like Ymir, when the boy inevitably makes contact with the hallucigenia, it'll give form to what lies within his heart. But despite the fact that he's grown up in a war-torn society, his circumstances are, in many ways, the opposite of what Ymir's had once been. Instead of being hunted by dogs, he has one as a companion. Instead of being injured, he's unharmed. But most importantly, while Ymir had been driven into the tree out of fear, this boy had entered of his own volition. He's already free, and is seemingly an explorer driven by his curiosity. And those differences are what tells us that the Titans won't be reborn. So what will be created when he meets the hallucigenia? It's impossible to know, but given that the boy shares none of the characteristics that led to the Titans' creation in the first place, it's not a stretch to say that it may be something entirely different in nature. There's nothing saying that what's created has to be a bad thing. I want to end this video off with a question. Why did Isayama choose to include any of this in the story at all? What message was he trying to convey with this boy, and by leaving the future undetermined? Even despite everything that had happened throughout the story, and everything our characters had fought for, war had returned to parity. Does that mean that everything that happened was meaningless? No, it does not. And I believe that that is the final message that Isayama leaves for us. The end of all human conflict was always wishful thinking. As was repeated so often throughout the story, humanity will only stop fighting amongst itself when there are no people left to fight. But even if conflict is an inevitability, it isn't a reason to give up. Through the efforts of everyone who had fought for peace, the world had been changed. The sins that had led to the Titans' creation had not been repeated by the following generations. This boy was proof of that. He would live a difficult life, and he would undoubtedly face many hardships. And yet, in the face of it all, he remained free. Humanity's conflict would never end, so long as it continued to exist. But just as that conflict was truly inevitable, so too was humanity's desire to seek an end to it. It was only the efforts of those who relentlessly fought for peace against all odds, who did everything in their power to prevent the sins of the past from being repeated, that were capable of reaching such an impossible goal. I believe that this is what Isayama is trying to tell us, and is ultimately the message of Attack on Titan.